Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. A delivery driver reported that someone opened the door before they could knock. The person used the correct name and took the order without hesitation. Minutes later, the actual resident called to ask where their food was. The driver sat in his car for several minutes after the call, letting the engine idle while he stared at the quiet street. The evening had settled into a soft, muted haze. Streetlights glowed weakly through a thin mist, their reflections pooling across the slick asphalt. He could hear the distant hum of a train, the faint squeak of a gate swinging somewhere nearby, and the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a cool breeze. He tapped the notes into his phone again, careful to get the details right. Door opened before knock. Correct name used. Order taken. Actual resident called. Unknown person. Each entry felt deliberate, a way to anchor a sense of clarity against the odd unease that had crept in. The next day, he returned to the neighborhood on a regular delivery. This time, he approached the house with a quiet awareness, scanning the porch and hedges. Something he hadn't noticed before caught his attention. The welcome mat was slightly askew, a corner folded under as if someone had shifted it while coming in and out. There were faint scuff marks along the bottom of the door frame, almost invisible against the brown paint, but the sunlight revealed them clearly. He crouched to examine them, feeling the subtle groove beneath his fingertip, then straightened when a neighbor waved from across the street. At the cafe a few blocks away, he mentioned the incident to the barista while waiting for his coffee. She paused, then lowered her voice. "Some drivers mentioned missing deliveries around here last week," she said. "People think it's just mistakes, but the patterns, they're too consistent." She didn't give more, but the implication lingered, heavy and quiet, like a soft pressure in the air. Later, he walked along the side street that ran behind a row of houses. Narrow alleys and small fenced yards offered paths that could be easily overlooked. Near a corner, a small delivery bag lay partially hidden behind a dumpster, its fabric creased and dulled from repeated use. He bent down to pick it up, noticing the faint abrasion along a strap, a sign it had been carried roughly. It was minor, easily missed, but in his mind it linked back to the first incident, a trace of someone moving methodically through the neighborhood. The following evening, he returned to the original house after his shift, walking slowly along the sidewalk as dusk deepened. The porch light flickered intermittently, throwing uneven shadows across the steps. He noticed the mailbox slightly ajar, and, inside, a slip of paper folded neatly. No name, no signature, just a typed message. "Be mindful of deliveries." He turned it over in his hands, noting the precision, the care in leaving a warning without confrontation. Over the next week, he began recording small details across the street and the alleyways. Gaps in fences wide enough to pass through unseen, footprints in damp soil that didn't match residents' shoes, occasional mail left on porches despite signs of occupancy. Each observation felt incremental, a quiet thread forming beneath the surface of the neighborhood's ordinary routines. One morning, he noticed a neighbor across the street watching him carefully from a second-floor window. The person didn't move as he passed, just stayed, arms folded, eyes fixed. He felt a flicker of awareness, a subtle reminder that someone else might be monitoring the same streets, quietly, without raising alarm. By the end of the week, his notebook had become a catalog of ordinary streets and ordinary houses, overlaid with irregularities, doors slightly ajar, packages displaced, faint scuff marks, and those typed warnings. Each clue was small, almost imperceptible, yet together they suggested an orchestrated pattern. Somewhere, out of sight, someone was moving deliberately through these routines, leaving evidence only for those paying attention, and the driver had begun to notice. The case had no dramatic confrontation, no sudden revelation, only the steady accumulation of subtle traces, the slow, quiet understanding that a crime was happening in plain view, carefully concealed within the ordinary rhythms of daily life. He started arriving earlier on his shifts, parking at the far end of the street so he could watch the houses without being noticed. Morning light filtered through a thin layer of fog, making the familiar neighborhood feel quieter than usual, almost suspended. The leaves along the hedges glistened with dew, and the occasional bird call punctuated the stillness. He noticed how easily shadows pooled in the recessed corners of the porch and under the low shrubs. On one of his rounds, he paused outside a small apartment building a block over. The stairwell smelled faintly of mildew and cleaning solution. The metal railing was scratched in multiple places, minor gouges that seemed random, but their pattern drew the eye if you lingered. A faintly crumpled receipt lay just outside the entrance. He bent to pick it up and saw it was from a nearby cafe, time-stamped only hours earlier. It wasn't his, nor did it belong to any resident he knew, but it indicated someone had passed through. Later that day, he stopped at a laundromat a few streets away, trying to blend in while reviewing his notes. Machines whirred softly, and the smell of detergent hung in the air. The attendant, a middle-aged man with ink-stained fingers, glanced at him while folding clothes and said quietly, "You're not the first to notice deliveries going missing around here. Some folks get their packages returned days later. Always a pattern, never a face." The driver nodded, noting the phrase. Pattern, not face. That stuck. He returned to the alley behind the row of townhouses. A thin, metallic glint caught his eye. A piece of a torn shipping label caught on the fence, fluttering slightly in the breeze. He knelt, brushing it gently between his fingers. The label had been partially erased. Only fragments of the address remained, but enough to match it to the first house he'd visited. That evening, he walked past a community garden tucked between two apartment buildings. The wooden planters were damp from a recent rain, and the soil showed tiny footprints, some smudged, others precise, like someone had stepped carefully to avoid leaving clear impressions. The subtle disturbances didn't make sense on their own, but in his mind they layered onto the other small traces he'd been collecting: scuffed doors, misaligned mats, stray receipts, and the note warning about deliveries. He began to notice patterns in timing too. Certain houses always had porch lights turned off at the precise moments he arrived. Shadows would move behind curtains in ways that didn't align with normal activity. A neighbor, an older woman walking her dog each morning, mentioned casually that she'd seen someone slipping through the hedges at odd hours, always in a hurry, never speaking, never stopping. She couldn't describe a face. On another night, he checked the side alley near the original street. The air was damp and still, carrying the faint smell of mulch and exhaust from a nearby street. A discarded plastic bag lay near a drain pipe, nothing unusual at first glance. He bent to inspect it and found an empty beverage container with a label matching a local chain. The timestamp on the label was days old, but its placement suggested someone had used the path repeatedly, leaving incidental traces in the quiet corners of the neighborhood. He started marking these locations on a map, connecting streets, alleys, and minor passages between houses. No single detail seemed significant alone, but the collection formed a faint lattice across the area, a hidden network beneath the ordinary routines of residents. Each observation, the misaligned mat, the scuffed door frame, the discarded receipt, felt like part of a larger, deliberate pattern, one orchestrated to go unnoticed yet traceable to someone careful, methodical, and present. The driver began to realize the crime wasn't sudden or violent. It was quiet, calculated, and embedded in the day-to-day life of the neighborhood. And somewhere nearby, the person responsible was moving just out of view, leaving subtle signs for only the most attentive observers, while the rest of the street carried on, unaware. He started taking a different route home, weaving through side streets he'd barely noticed before. The air was damp, carrying the faint scent of freshly mown grass mixed with exhaust from a nearby highway. Streetlights glimmered through thin clouds, painting the asphalt in muted pools of yellow. He paused at a small park tucked between two apartment blocks, its benches wet from an earlier drizzle. Footprints marred the soft soil around the edge, some fresh, some faded, overlapping like layers of careful movement. Across the street, a corner shop emitted a soft hum from its refrigeration units. The driver ducked inside, ostensibly for a snack, but his attention was drawn to a narrow side alley behind the building. Rusted metal gates and faded signage suggested it was seldom used, but scraps of paper and a faint shoe print in the dirt hinted someone had passed through recently. He crouched briefly, brushing a fingertip along the print. It was small, deliberate, almost measured. The next day, he revisited a house on the opposite side of the block. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of movement caught his eye through a gap. A delivery bag rested on the porch, slightly tilted, and the mat was pushed to one side. He crouched to inspect the faint scuff along the doorframe. It matched the markings he'd seen at the first house. Carefully, he took a photo, making sure not to disturb anything. Later, at a laundromat a few streets away, he overheard two patrons talking quietly. One mentioned that several deliveries had gone missing in their building over the past month, parcels showing up in odd locations or simply disappearing. The driver didn't interject, only noted the information. Even casual remarks like this were pieces of a larger picture. That evening, he walked past a row of townhouses near the edge of the neighborhood. A narrow footpath ran behind them, lined with low hedges. He noticed a faint glimmer of metal at the base of one hedge, a small key, slightly bent, partially buried in damp soil. He picked it up gingerly, noting its age and wear. It wasn't labeled, but its presence in an otherwise quiet path felt intentional, as though someone had left it behind without expecting it to be found. Returning home, he spread his notes across the table. Photographs, sketches of footprints, times of observed movements, and the stray key. The details seemed small, disconnected even, yet together they suggested a pattern. Someone moving silently through the neighborhood, leaving evidence that was subtle but consistent. A few nights later, he lingered near a fenced-off lot behind an old apartment complex. The lot was littered with broken branches and scattered leaves. In the dim light, he saw a faint shadow slip between two buildings, too quick to identify. Only a soft scrape of metal against concrete lingered in the air. He stood still, holding his breath, aware that whoever was moving through these streets was careful, precise, and aware of their surroundings, watching, testing, moving without leaving obvious traces. Each day, his routine shifted slightly. He noted porch lights that flickered on and off at odd times, packages left on stoops that didn't belong to anyone, and subtle disturbances in mailboxes and hedges. Every observation became another thread, another quiet piece of evidence building towards something larger, something deliberate. he began to feel the rhythm of the neighborhood differently. Ordinary streets, ordinary houses, ordinary routines, all overlaid with a hidden structure, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable once you started noticing. Someone was moving methodically through the ordinary, leaving traces that only careful eyes would catch, and the driver had begun to trace the faint lines of a crime unfolding quietly, deliberately, in plain sight. The driver began arriving at his first delivery stops earlier in the evening, when the streets were quiet and the sun was just low enough to cast long, soft shadows across the sidewalks. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and exhaust, and the occasional rustle of leaves made him pause, thinking he had caught movement out of the corner of his eye. A small park near the center of the neighborhood caught his attention. Benches wet from a recent drizzle, the faint indentation of footprints in soft soil, each step angled carefully, deliberately. He wandered closer to the back alley between two apartment blocks, where a narrow path ran alongside dumpsters and chain-link fences. The metal gate squeaked faintly in the wind, and something small and metallic caught his eye near the base. A torn label from a food delivery bag, partially coated with dirt. He crouched, brushing it lightly with a fingertip. The remnants of an address printed on the label matched the first house where the theft had occurred. Later, at a convenience store on the corner of a different street, he noticed the cashier glancing briefly at him while restocking shelves. The driver lingered, casually picking up a coffee, and overheard a quiet conversation between two patrons. "Packages disappearing again," one said, voice low, like someone knows the routines. The driver nodded subtly, letting the information sink. The pattern of the missing deliveries seemed broader than he had first realized. That night, he took a route along a quieter street lined with small townhouses. Each porch had subtle irregularities, a welcome mat pushed to one side, a faint scuff along a doorframe, a piece of paper tucked beneath a door that shouldn't have been there. One house had a small side gate slightly ajar. Behind it, a thin path led between the hedges. The driver crouched briefly to examine faint, muddy footprints that led from the alley behind the street and disappeared into the side yard. On a separate day, he stopped by a small laundromat to wait between deliveries. The hum of the machines filled the space, mingling with the faint smell of detergent. A man folding clothes in the corner mentioned casually, "Some people around here are always missing deliveries. Odd how they show up later in strange places." The driver didn't ask more, but he wrote the comment down in his notebook. Small remarks like this layered into the quiet architecture of his investigation. That evening, he returned to the original street. A package had been left on a neighbor's stoop, damp from a passing rain. It bore no note or name, but the type of bag and the way it was placed reminded him of the first stolen order. Nearby, a mailbox hung slightly crooked, and the lock showed faint scratches. He took photos of the details and recorded the times carefully, aware that the arrangement of these small disturbances was deliberate, though the person responsible remained invisible. Across the neighborhood, he noticed recurring patterns: lights flickering on and off in empty apartments, curtains moving though no one was home, faint noises of footsteps along narrow passages between buildings. He began mapping the streets, marking alleys, side gates, and paths that allowed someone to move unseen. Each day, the ordinary became laced with irregularities, small, precise signs that someone had been passing through quietly, collecting deliveries without detection. One night, lingering near a fenced-off lot behind a row of older apartments, he spotted a shadow slip between buildings, vanishing before he could identify it. Only the soft scrape of metal against concrete lingered in the still air. He realized the person responsible was methodical, aware, leaving traces that were easy to miss unless someone paid close attention. As his notebook filled with observations, photographs, maps, scuffs, misaligned mats, discarded labels, he began to feel the rhythm of the neighborhood differently. The quiet streets, ordinary houses, and routine movements were no longer random. They formed a lattice of deliberate activity. Someone was conducting a crime that relied entirely on subtlety and observation, moving through the everyday unnoticed. And he was tracing it, step by careful step, through the small, almost imperceptible clues left behind. He began leaving the car running for longer stretches, letting the faint vibration hum under him while he observed. The fog hung low across the street, softening the edges of parked cars and mailboxes, turning the neighborhood into a muted, almost timeless space. A single street lamp flickered intermittently, casting a rhythm that seemed to mirror the quiet tension he felt, each pulse of light revealing and concealing in turn. That afternoon, he took a route past a small, aging library at the edge of the district. The building smelled faintly of paper and varnish, and the narrow alley beside it was littered with a scattering of leaves and small scraps of cardboard. A delivery flyer had been caught under a low fence, edges damp and curling. He bent to pick it up, noting the time stamped on the bottom, coinciding almost exactly with one of the missing orders he'd logged. It was a minor detail, easy to dismiss, yet he tucked it into his notebook carefully. Later, he paused outside a convenience store at the corner of a side street. The neon sign buzzed faintly, reflecting on the puddles along the sidewalk. Inside, the cashier moved deliberately behind the counter, eyes briefly tracking him as he lingered. A customer mentioned that several deliveries had been misdirected recently, items turning up in odd locations or never at all. The driver listened quietly, nodding, writing down the comment along with the date and approximate time. Small observations like this were starting to form a faint, almost invisible grid of activity. He returned that evening to the first street, walking slowly, noting subtle changes in the houses. The side gate at one townhouse was now closed, but slightly misaligned. He crouched to examine the soil beneath. There were faint, shallow prints that didn't match any shoes he recognized. Near the porch, a corner of the mat had been folded over, as if someone had shifted it while stepping carefully. Inside the mailbox, a folded note printed on plain paper had been slipped between the slots. "Watch your deliveries." No signature, no indication of identity. The next day, he visited a quiet cul-de-sac a few blocks over. The street was narrow, lined with low hedges and occasional lampposts. At the far end, a small community garden was fenced off with thin wire, but he noticed the soil along the edges had been disturbed recently. Tiny footprints led from the edge of the garden toward a low gate that opened onto the street. He crouched, brushing the dirt lightly, noting the way the impression suggested someone had moved carefully, deliberately, leaving minimal trace. That night, he lingered near an old apartment complex at the neighborhood's edge. A faint glow came from a second-story window, though the building appeared empty from the street. A soft sound of metal, like a hinge scraping, echoed briefly through the still air. He froze, listening, and for a moment imagined someone moving along the hallways above, conducting the same quiet, deliberate patterns he'd been tracing for days. Each observation added a new layer. Misaligned mats, shallow footprints, small discarded labels, fleeting glimmers of movement in alleys, notes slipped into mailboxes. Alone, Each detail was almost insignificant, but together they began to form a faint, deliberate pattern, a map of someone's movements across ordinary streets, exploiting routine and quiet to act without detection. By the end of the week, he could feel it. The rhythm of the neighborhood had changed under his awareness. Shadows, small noises, the angle of porch lights, the placement of packages, all seemed to carry meaning now. Someone was moving methodically through these streets, and though no confrontation had occurred, the evidence, the quiet, persistent traces, was accumulating like a pulse beneath the surface. He followed it cautiously, deliberately, aware that every step, every observation, was part of tracing a crime that was invisible to anyone not paying attention. He started arriving at the neighborhood just as dawn was breaking, the light pale and diffused through a thin layer of mist. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and concrete, carrying the distant, metallic tang of a train moving somewhere beyond the horizon. Cars were parked along the street in familiar patterns, yet he noticed small irregularities, a tire slightly turned, a side mirror angled differently, a recycling bin nudged half a foot forward. Each anomaly seemed insignificant, but the accumulation was starting to feel deliberate. He walked past a small medical clinic tucked between two apartment buildings. The glass doors reflected the rising sun, and a faint scuff mark ran along the threshold. He crouched, brushing a fingertip over it. It was subtle, as though someone had stepped carefully to avoid leaving a clear print, yet enough to register under close observation. Near the entrance, a single discarded flyer for a local pharmacy had been caught under a patch of mulch, its corner folded and damp. He slipped it into his notebook. Later, he paused at a corner park where a narrow path ran alongside an overgrown hedge. The grass was flattened in places, suggesting repeated passage, but no one was present. A small scrap of plastic, part of a delivery bag, rested near the base of a tree, partially hidden beneath leaves. He picked it up, noting the faint abrasion along the edge, as if it had been carried roughly but deliberately placed out of view. That evening, he stopped outside a row of townhouses on the far end of the block. Each porch seemed ordinary, yet his attention caught on subtle discrepancies. A mat slightly shifted, a door frame with minor scuffs, mail pushed into a corner rather than stacked neatly. At one house, the mailbox was ajar, and inside a thin strip of paper had been tucked between the slots. Checked carefully. No name, no handwriting, just a typed warning. He photographed it carefully, noting the date and time. A few days later, he visited a small coffee shop off a side street. The interior smelled of roasted beans and paper, the hum of espresso machines mingling with quiet conversation. While waiting, he overheard a customer mention, almost casually, that several residents had reported missing deliveries. Items reappeared later, sometimes in odd places, sometimes never at all. The comment felt small, but in his mind it fit into the larger lattice of patterns he was starting to map. That night, he walked along a narrow alley behind the original street, the air damp and still, carrying faint hints of mulch and distant exhaust. A faint glint caught his eye at the base of a fence. A small metal clasp, slightly bent, lay partially buried in soft soil. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. It bore the kind of wear that suggested repeated use, yet it had been left here intentionally, or forgotten in haste. Returning home, he spread his notes across the table. Photos, sketches of footprints, times of observed movements, small fragments of discarded material. Each piece alone seemed trivial, but together they formed a subtle network, a hidden layer beneath the ordinary streets. He could sense the rhythm now, Misaligned mats, minor scuffs, fleeting shadows, discarded scraps. Someone was moving methodically through the neighborhood, leaving a quiet trail that was nearly invisible unless someone paid close attention. On another quiet evening, he lingered near a fenced-off lot behind a small apartment building. The lot was littered with leaves and scattered branches, but among them, faint footprints led to a side gate. A soft scrape of metal echoed briefly against the stillness, like a hinge or clasp moved with care. He froze, listening, aware that the person responsible for the thefts was deliberate and precise, leaving traces small enough to be overlooked yet consistent enough to form a map for those watching. The neighborhood felt different now, ordinary yet layered with subtle disturbances. The driver moved carefully through the streets, tracing the invisible lines left by someone conducting a crime that relied entirely on observation, timing, and patience. Each day, each small discovery, scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, footprints in damp soil, discarded labels, anonymous warnings, added to the quiet understanding that the crime was ongoing, methodical, and happening in plain sight. And with every step he took, he felt closer to the hidden rhythm, aware that someone else was moving just beyond his view, watching and waiting. The next morning, he arrived before the streets had fully woken, the sidewalks slick with overnight dew and a thin fog lingering in the low corners between buildings. He moved deliberately, taking note of every subtle irregularity. A garden gate slightly ajar, a fence hinge quietly creaking with the wind, and the soft indentation of shoe prints in the soil near the alley behind the townhouses. The impressions were faint but patterned, suggesting repeated passage rather than a single accident. He paused outside a small, shuttered bakery whose brickwork had begun to fade with age. A paper cup, crumpled and damp, lay near the corner of the stoop. It wasn't unusual to find litter, but the positioning seemed deliberate, nestled in the shadow of the doorway, where it might go unnoticed unless someone paused. He bent down, sliding a fingertip over the paper, and noticed a faint smudge along the rim, the kind left when someone handled a disposable cup while carrying a package. Later that day, he stopped by a neighborhood hardware store, ostensibly to pick up tape for deliveries. The bell above the door jingled softly as he entered. While the clerk stocked shelves, he overheard a resident asking quietly if the store had any report of a missing parcel returned by mistake. The clerk shook her head and muttered, "Happens more than people admit. Small things, packages, deliveries, sometimes they come back in weird places." The driver noted the comment, realizing that even casual observations were beginning to form a network of corroborating details. That evening, he returned to the alley behind the apartment complex. The ground was soft from a light rain earlier in the day, and he crouched to inspect the footprints he had started cataloging. They were shallow but consistent, moving toward a gap in a low hedge that opened onto a side street. Along the path, a fragment of paper had caught on a root, edges damp and curling. He retrieved it carefully and saw a faint imprint of text, partially legible, a delivery address matching one of the incidents from the first week. He wandered further, past a small community garden tucked between two brick buildings. The raised planters were wet, and soil had been disturbed along the edges, revealing subtle, careful footprints leading toward a narrow wooden gate that led back into the street. He crouched, running a finger along the soft impressions, noting the precision of each step, deliberate, unhurried, and consistent with the other traces he had collected. A few blocks over, he stopped at a coffee shop to review his notes. The hum of the espresso machine mingled with the soft murmur of early patrons. He spread out the small scraps of evidence he had gathered. Photos of scuffed door frames, notes tucked in mailboxes, torn labels, and footprints. Alone, each seemed trivial, but together they hinted at a methodical process, a quiet orchestration beneath the ordinary rhythm of the neighborhood. Later that night, he moved along a quiet residential street lined with narrow alleyways and overgrown hedges. A faint flicker of light caught his attention from the corner of a window above a small garage. He paused, listening to the almost imperceptible scrape of metal, like a latch being lifted and set down carefully. The noise vanished as suddenly as it appeared, leaving only the stillness of the night and the wet scent of concrete. Every step, every pause, every small detail, the misaligned mat, the shallow footprints, the folded notes, the faint scraps of labels, layered together in his mind. The neighborhood had taken on a new texture, ordinary yet subtly altered, threaded with traces of someone's deliberate movement. Someone was acting quietly, methodically, leaving evidence only for the careful observer. And the driver, increasingly aware of the hidden patterns, followed the faint, deliberate trail, step by cautious step, through streets that looked familiar but were slowly revealing themselves to be anything but ordinary. He began arriving even earlier on his rounds, before the first hint of sunlight warmed the streets. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and fallen leaves. Shadows pooled beneath parked cars, and the occasional clatter of a loose sign swaying in the wind seemed louder in the quiet. He slowed his steps, observing every detail: a hedge clipped unevenly, a garden gate left slightly unlatched, a newspaper blown partially across a porch. Each irregularity, however small, felt intentional. A few blocks away, a narrow, forgotten pathway ran behind a line of old brick row houses. The driver noticed it for the first time that morning, its surface scattered with damp leaves and a few stray pieces of litter. A faint scrape along the pavement caught his eye, shallow and narrow, as if someone had dragged a small object lightly across the ground. He crouched, brushing away the leaves, and saw the impression of a thin strap, curved and precise. He pressed a fingertip gently into the mark, registering its depth and angle. Later, he stopped at a small bookstore tucked between two apartment buildings. The smell of old paper and polish hung in the air. While browsing a shelf near the back, he overheard a woman talking quietly to the cashier. "Some of the packages around here just vanish," she said. "Then they show up days later, somewhere you wouldn't expect. Always the same pattern." He noted the words, the quiet emphasis, and tucked the observation into his notebook. That evening, he returned to the alley behind the original row of townhouses. The ground was soft from a light rain earlier, and the impressions he had cataloged were easier to see. He followed a series of faint footprints that led toward a low chain-link fence, where the soil had been disturbed as if someone had climbed carefully over it. Just beyond, a small patch of concrete was scuffed with tiny abrasions, nearly imperceptible unless you bent close to observe. He wandered further, past a narrow cul-de-sac where a small community garden was tucked between two brick buildings. Raised planters were damp and glistening, and the earth along the edges was disturbed in a consistent pattern. Tiny, shallow footprints threaded along the pathway, leading to a gate that opened onto the street. He traced the impressions with his finger, noting the careful, measured steps and the deliberate avoidance of any obvious trace. A few nights later, he visited a laundromat on a side street. The hum of machines filled the space, mingling with the faint scent of detergent. A man folding clothes mentioned casually that several deliveries had ended up in odd places, and no one could figure out why. The driver didn't respond, only wrote it down, aware that each small remark was part of a larger network of evidence forming slowly in the quiet. That evening, he lingered near an empty lot behind a low apartment building. The ground was littered with leaves and small debris, but faint footprints led to a narrow side gate, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. A soft metallic scrape echoed briefly, like a latch being lifted, then silence. He crouched to examine the footprints, noting their careful placement, the consistency with other paths he had traced over the past week. Returning home, he spread his growing collection of notes, photographs, and sketches across the table. Scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, footprints in soft soil, fragments of labels, and subtle warnings tucked into mailboxes. Alone, each detail seemed trivial. Together, they formed a lattice of deliberate, measured movements across the neighborhood. The pattern was becoming clearer. Not a single, overt act, but a quiet, methodical orchestration beneath the surface of ordinary life. As the nights passed, he felt the rhythm of the streets more keenly. Ordinary houses and familiar sidewalks were overlaid with subtle irregularities. Packages left in unusual positions, brief flickers of movement behind curtains, slight distortions in the placement of objects that only careful observation could detect. The person responsible was moving deliberately, quietly, leaving a trail for no one but the most attentive observer, and the driver had begun following it, one careful, measured step at a time. He started taking longer walks after his shifts, letting the quiet streets settle around him before moving. The air smelled faintly of damp asphalt and mulch from nearby gardens, the occasional hum of a distant air conditioner punctuating the stillness. He paused outside a narrow, overlooked lane that ran behind an older set of townhouses. The paint on the fences was chipped, and leaves had gathered in the corners. A faint scrape along the ground suggested someone had brushed against the side of a trash can. He crouched to examine it, noticing a thin streak of dirt that led toward a low, rusted gate. Further down the street, he noticed the corner of a brick apartment building partially obscured by a cluster of overgrown shrubs. A small scrap of paper, damp and curling, had been caught against a bush. He picked it up carefully and saw faint printed text, an order number from one of the missing deliveries, partially smudged by moisture. It seemed insignificant on its own, but he placed it in his notebook, aware that the accumulation of these fragments was beginning to form a faint, coherent map. Later, he stopped by a small diner tucked between two larger stores. The smell of coffee and toast hung in the air, and a single waitress moved silently behind the counter. While sipping a cup, he overheard a brief exchange. A local resident mentioned that packages had been showing up in odd spots for weeks. No one knew why. The driver noted the remark, feeling the pattern of recurring, unexplained disturbances expanding in his awareness. That evening, he retraced a route past the alley behind the row houses near the original street. The ground was damp, making faint impressions easier to see. He followed a trail of shallow footprints that led toward a side gate, partially obscured by hedges. Near the base of the gate, he found a tiny metal clip, slightly bent, that might have once held a parcel bag. He examined it closely, noting the wear and how carefully it had been handled. He wandered further into a quieter cul-de-sac, where the old community garden sat behind low fences. The raised planters glistened from a recent rain, and the soil along the edges had been disturbed with a subtle pattern. as if someone had walked deliberately to avoid leaving obvious prints. Tiny footprints traced along the paths, leading to a small gate that opened onto the street. He crouched, tracing the impressions gently with his fingertip, absorbing the precision and care evident in each step. A few nights later, he lingered near an abandoned parking lot at the edge of the neighborhood. Broken branches and scattered leaves littered the ground, but faint marks led to a narrow side entrance of a low brick building. A soft metallic scrape echoed briefly, like a latch lifted and reset, vanishing almost immediately into the still air. He knelt, studying the path, noting the careful, almost ritualistic avoidance of anything that might leave an obvious trace. Returning home, he spread his notes, photographs, and sketches across the table. Scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, footprints, fragments of labels, and folded papers tucked into mailboxes formed a lattice of movement across the streets. Alone, each piece seemed trivial, but together they revealed a deliberate network. The person responsible wasn't violent, wasn't chaotic. They moved quietly, deliberately, through familiar streets, leaving evidence only for someone paying attention. As the nights deepened, he began to sense the hidden rhythm of the neighborhood. Ordinary streets and familiar houses carried subtle distortions. Misplaced packages, faint flickers behind drawn curtains, shallow scrapes on concrete, a folded corner of paper in a mailbox. The driver had begun to follow these disturbances like threads, careful, deliberate, tracing a quiet, ongoing crime that unfolded beneath the ordinary, unnoticed by anyone but him. He started moving along the older section of the neighborhood, where narrow streets wound between low brick buildings and small patches of unkempt grass. The morning mist clung to the corners of fences and hedges, softening edges, muting sounds. Footsteps of early pedestrians echoed faintly, each one a potential interruption, so he slowed, keeping to the shadows, letting his eyes scan every doorway, every stoop, every mailbox. Near a corner pharmacy, he noticed a faint disturbance in the mulch along a narrow garden bed. Small, shallow impressions led toward a side entrance he had never paid attention to before. The soil was soft from overnight rain, revealing the shape of a sole and the subtle twist of a heel as someone moved carefully across it. He crouched and traced the edges lightly, noting the direction and the deliberate pace the impression suggested. A few blocks over, he stopped at a laundromat whose windows fogged from heat inside. While waiting for his laundry to finish, he overheard a soft conversation between two patrons. One mentioned that a series of deliveries had recently gone missing, sometimes reappearing days later in other buildings or in odd corners. The driver didn't interject, only wrote the details into his notebook: dates, approximate times, locations. That evening, he wandered through a side street lined with townhouses that leaned slightly forward from age. The front porches were small, each one with its own idiosyncrasies. A mat turned slightly, a garden gnome nudged to the side, a mailbox hanging crooked. Near one porch, a scrap of plastic from a food bag had caught in the corner of the steps, damp and curling. He picked it up, examined it carefully, noting faint scratches along the edges as if it had been handled roughly but placed with intention. Further along, a narrow alley ran between two apartment blocks. The asphalt was dark and wet, scattered with fallen leaves. He followed faint, shallow footprints toward a low fence, where the soil had been disturbed slightly, suggesting someone had climbed over or crouched to pass through. Near the base of the fence, he found a small, bent metal clip. It looked ordinary, yet its presence, combined with the footprints and the path it marked, suggested careful, deliberate movement. A few nights later, he paused near a fenced-off lot behind a corner building. The lot was empty, littered with broken branches and leaves, yet faint impressions led to a small gate, partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. A soft metallic scrape echoed briefly, like a latch being lifted and set down again. He knelt to examine the marks, noting their consistency with paths he had tracked in other areas of the neighborhood. Returning home, he spread his growing collection of evidence across the table. Photos of scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, shallow footprints, scraps of labels, and folded papers left in mailboxes. Each detail alone seemed insignificant, but together they formed a quiet lattice of movement, an invisible network threading through the ordinary streets and ordinary lives around him. The neighborhood felt different now. Every corner, every porch, every alley carried subtle disturbances. Mislaid packages, faint flickers behind drawn curtains, soft scrapes on concrete, and discarded scraps of paper. The driver followed these threads carefully, step by step, becoming attuned to the hidden rhythm of someone moving quietly, deliberately, through familiar streets. Each observation added another layer to the slowly unfolding picture of a crime conducted entirely in silence, in plain sight, yet invisible to anyone not paying close attention. That morning, he arrived at the neighborhood while the sun was still low, casting pale light across the wet sidewalks. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of asphalt warmed by the early light. He moved slowly, pausing at each corner, letting his eyes sweep over doorways, mailboxes, and the narrow strips of grass lining the street. A garden gate hung slightly off its hinges, moving ever so gently in the morning breeze. He crouched, noticing a faint line in the soil that suggested someone had leaned against it recently. Further down, he came across a small, overlooked alley between two older apartment blocks. The walls were streaked with age and moisture, moss growing in the cracks. Near the base of one building, a thin scrap of plastic had been pressed into the dirt, almost invisible unless bent close. He picked it up and saw faint markings that matched the type of packaging used for deliveries he had cataloged earlier. He placed it carefully into his notebook, noting the precise location and time. Later, he wandered past a narrow street lined with low-rise townhouses. Each porch seemed ordinary, yet small irregularities caught his attention. A mat pushed slightly aside, a piece of paper tucked beneath a planter, faint scuffs along the doorframe. Near one stoop, he found a metal clip, bent and dulled, partially hidden by fallen leaves. He examined it, running a fingertip along the edges, noticing the wear patterns, the subtle way it suggested repeated careful handling. At the corner, a small coffee shop glowed warmly in the still misty morning. Inside, he overheard a quiet conversation, a patron mentioning that several deliveries had been misplaced or turned up in strange spots over the past week. The driver jotted it down, aware that these casual remarks formed part of a larger, slowly emerging pattern. That evening, he explored a cul-de-sac at the edge of the neighborhood, where an overgrown community garden lay tucked between two brick buildings. The raised planters glistened from a passing drizzle, and the soil had been disturbed in a careful, consistent way. Small footprints traced along the narrow paths, leading to a side gate that opened onto the street. He crouched to follow the impressions, noting the measured, deliberate steps that suggested someone moving with care, avoiding leaving anything obvious behind. A few nights later, he paused at a fenced-off lot behind a long, low apartment block. The The lot was littered with broken branches and wet leaves. Faint tracks led to a side gate partially obscured by shrubs, where a soft metallic scrape echoed briefly in the still air, like a latch being lifted and replaced. He crouched, studying the impressions, aware that the careful, precise movements mirrored those he had catalogued elsewhere. Returning home, he spread his collection of evidence across the table. Photographs of scuffed door frames, displaced mats, faint footprints, fragments of labels, and folded papers tucked into mailboxes. Each element seemed minor alone, yet together they traced an invisible web of activity threading through the neighborhood. The streets now held a quiet tension. Ordinary houses and familiar paths were layered with subtle irregularities, mislaid packages, faint flickers behind curtains, soft scrapes along door frames, carefully placed scraps of paper. Each observation added to the map of a deliberate, ongoing crime conducted quietly in plain sight. The driver moved carefully, tracing the faint rhythm left by someone meticulous and unseen, step by step, observation by observation, aware that each clue, however small, was part of a slowly revealing truth. He started taking the longer route home that evening, moving slowly through streets he had never paid much attention to before. The sky was a deep indigo, and the faint hum of distant traffic mingled with the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. He paused outside a narrow strip of abandoned shops, their windows streaked with dust and moisture. A single flickering neon sign cast uneven light across the cracked pavement. Near the base of one door, he noticed a tiny scrap of paper, almost completely hidden beneath a puddle formed by a rain gutter. He bent to pick it up. Faint ink markings matched the type of receipt from one of the missing deliveries. A few blocks further, he wandered past a small, tucked-away playground behind an apartment building. The swings swayed slightly in the night air, squeaking softly. In the corner, a piece of a delivery bag lay partially hidden under a low bush, damp and pressed into the soil. He crouched and pressed his fingers against it, noting a subtle abrasion along one edge, as if it had been handled carefully and placed deliberately. Later, he stopped at a quiet residential street with low brick row houses. Each house looked ordinary, yet his eyes caught small deviations, a doormat slightly askew, a faint scuff along a door frame, a mailbox that had been nudged to the side. Near one stoop, a small metal clip had been left on the edge of the steps, bent and worn. He traced the edge with a fingertip, noting the careful handling it suggested. That night, he moved along an alley behind a series of townhouses. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of soil and decaying leaves. He followed shallow footprints that led toward a side gate partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. Just beyond, a soft metallic scrape sounded briefly, like a latch being lifted and reset. He crouched, inspecting the path and noting the deliberate, measured steps, consistent with the other impressions he had been tracing for days. A few mornings later, he paused near a small community garden tucked between two low apartment buildings. The raised planters glistened with dew, and the soil along the edges had been disturbed with subtle precision. Tiny footprints threaded along the narrow paths, leading to a gate opening onto the street. He crouched to trace the impressions with his fingertip, noticing how deliberate and careful each step had been, avoiding obvious trace while leaving a consistent pattern. At a laundromat down a quiet side street, he overheard a brief exchange between two patrons about missing packages, some reappearing days later in unusual locations. He wrote it down, aware that these casual observations were quietly building the larger picture. Back home, He spread his evidence across the table: scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, shallow footprints, scraps of labels, and folded papers tucked into mailboxes. Alone, each detail seemed minor, but together they formed a lattice of movement threading through the neighborhood. The streets now carried a new texture, ordinary and familiar, yet subtly altered. Misplaced packages, faint flickers behind drawn curtains, soft scrapes along concrete, and discarded scraps of paper all hinted at a presence moving deliberately through quiet streets. Step by careful step, the driver traced a methodical rhythm, watching patterns emerge across houses, alleys, and gardens. The crime was ongoing, meticulous, and almost invisible, a quiet orchestration in plain sight, waiting to reveal itself fully to the one who had begun to notice every subtle sign. He began exploring streets on the far edge of the neighborhood, where the buildings were older and the sidewalks cracked and uneven. Early morning mist clung to the low fences and hedges, dampening the faint sound of distant traffic. At the corner of a narrow lane, he noticed a gate slightly off its latch, swinging ever so gently in the wind. The soil beneath it bore subtle impressions, shallow and precise, as if someone had leaned against the frame while passing through. He crouched to examine them, pressing a fingertip into the dirt to trace the delicate pattern of movement. A few blocks away, a small, almost forgotten playground sat behind a brick apartment building. The swings moved softly in the morning air, squeaking faintly with each sway. At the edge of the sandbox, a fragment of a delivery bag had been pressed into the wet sand, corners curling. He picked it up and examined it closely. Faint abrasions suggested careful handling, a deliberate placement meant to remain unnoticed. Later, he stopped at a quiet row of townhouses with narrow porches. Each house seemed ordinary, yet small anomalies caught his attention. A mat turned slightly, a mailbox nudged off-center, a small scuff along a doorframe. Near one doorstep, he found a tiny metal clip, bent and dulled. He traced it with his fingertip, noting the way it bore evidence of repeated careful handling. That evening, he wandered through an alley behind the original series of row houses. The asphalt was dark and slick from a recent drizzle. Shallow footprints led toward a side gate partially obscured by overgrown shrubs. A soft metallic scrape echoed briefly, like a latch being lifted and replaced. He crouched to examine the path, noting the deliberate, measured steps that mirrored the patterns he had been tracking elsewhere. A few nights later, he explored a narrow cul-de-sac tucked between low-rise apartment buildings. The overgrown community garden glistened faintly from the evening dew. The soil along the raised planter edges had been disturbed subtly, with small footprints threading through the paths in a careful, consistent pattern. Each impression led toward a gate opening onto the street, the steps deliberate and precise, avoiding obvious trace, yet forming a silent map of movement. He visited a small coffee shop down a quiet side street, listening for any murmured remark. A customer mentioned that several deliveries had gone missing, sometimes reappearing days later in unusual locations. He recorded the observation, aware that even casual conversation was becoming part of a larger, emerging picture. Back home, he spread his collection of evidence across the table: scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, shallow footprints, scraps of labels, and folded papers tucked into mailboxes. Alone, each piece seemed minor, but together they formed an intricate lattice of movement threading through the neighborhood. The streets had taken on a new rhythm. Ordinary houses, familiar sidewalks, and quiet alleys now carried subtle irregularities: mislaid packages, faint flickers behind drawn curtains, soft scrapes on concrete, and carefully discarded scraps of paper. Step by careful step, he followed the quiet patterns, attuned to the hidden orchestration of someone moving deliberately through familiar streets. The crime remained ongoing, precise, and almost invisible, a deliberate presence weaving through the ordinary, leaving just enough trace for the observant to notice. He started walking the streets just before dawn, when the fog lay thick between the buildings and the streetlights cast a pale, uneven glow across wet asphalt. Along a narrow side street, he noticed a low brick wall with a faint scrape along its top edge, as if someone had rested a hand briefly while stepping over. He crouched, letting his fingers trace the mark, noting the subtle shift in dirt beneath, a footprint pressed lightly into the soft soil nearby. A few blocks later, he arrived at a small, shuttered florist tucked between two apartment buildings. The window display had wilted leaves pressed against the glass, and a thin piece of paper lay folded and damp on the sidewalk. He picked it up carefully, a partial label from one of the missing deliveries. The edges were frayed, and faint smudges suggested it had been handled, folded, and discarded deliberately. Further along, he paused outside a narrow row of townhouses. The front porches were small, each with its own quirks, a mat slightly askew, a mailbox leaning, a tiny chip in the doorframe. He crouched near one stoop, noticing a bent metal clip tucked against the steps, edges dulled. It seemed trivial, yet in context, it echoed other small items he had cataloged, a subtle signature of repeated, careful handling. That evening, he wandered through a long alley behind older brick buildings. The ground was slick with dew, faint footprints threading past discarded leaves and puddles. They led toward a gate partially hidden by shrubs. A soft metallic scrape sounded briefly, like a latch lifted and replaced. He crouched to examine the marks, noting the precise placement of each step, the care taken to avoid leaving anything obvious. Later that week, he explored a quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of the neighborhood. A small community garden nestled between two apartment blocks, its raised planters damp and disturbed. Tiny, shallow footprints threaded along narrow paths, leading toward a gate opening onto the street. He traced each impression slowly with his fingertip, observing the deliberate pattern of movement, the precision in each step. At a corner cafe, he overheard a hushed conversation. A local resident mentioned several deliveries that had vanished, only to reappear days later in strange places. He jotted it down in his notebook, aware that these small, casual observations added to the slowly emerging map of activity. Back at home, he spread his growing evidence across the table: scuffed door frames, misaligned mats, faint footprints, fragments of labels, and folded papers left in mailboxes. Alone, each item seemed insignificant, but together they formed a network of movement, connecting streets, alleys, and houses in a quiet, deliberate pattern. The neighborhood had transformed in his perception. Ordinary sidewalks, familiar porches, and quiet alleyways were now layered with subtle irregularities, mislaid packages, faint movements behind drawn curtains, soft scrapes on concrete, and carefully discarded paper fragments. Step by cautious step, he followed the invisible rhythm of someone meticulous, moving silently and deliberately through ordinary streets. The crime continued in plain sight, precise, methodical, and almost imperceptible, a quiet orchestration waiting to be noticed by anyone attentive enough to catch its traces. He returned to the neighborhood the next morning with the same quiet routine, following the faint paths he had observed for weeks. The air was cool, carrying the smell of damp leaves and the distant hum of early traffic. As he walked, he began to notice how the clues, previously isolated, were starting to form a coherent picture. The bent clips, the tiny scraps of packaging, the footprints, all pointed toward a single pattern. Someone who moved deliberately, quietly, and carefully, always leaving minimal traces. He stopped outside a small townhouse that had appeared frequently in his notes. The doorframe bore faint scuff marks consistent with the clips he had found elsewhere, and the mat had been nudged slightly to the side. Looking closer, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the soil beside the steps, matching the shallow footprints he had traced along the alleys. It wasn't a sign of intrusion in a violent sense. It was methodical, organized, and cautious. Later, at the corner cafe, he spoke quietly with a barista he had seen before. She mentioned that a new resident had moved in a few weeks prior, someone who often collected parcels on behalf of neighbors while they were away. The timing fit. He recalled the casual remarks overheard in the laundromat, the folded receipts and scraps of labels tucked in corners, the careful movement through gardens and alleys. Each small observation clicked into place. He revisited the paths, following the footprints and impressions one last time. The sequence of marks led him to a series of connected courtyards and alleyways, all ending near a single apartment. The realization settled gently. The person who had taken the deliveries was not acting out of malice, but habit. They were someone who had been collecting packages for convenience, perhaps with the intention of holding them safely for neighbors, or simply out of their own compulsion for order and control. The missing deliveries, the careful handling, the consistent movement, it all reflected a quiet, methodical behavior rather than criminal intent. He spoke with the resident whose order had been taken. They confirmed a neighbor had collected packages when people were not home, leaving them nearby for pickup. The pattern made sense now. The repeated traces, the faint scrapes, the small clips, and even the folded scraps of paper were the unintentional signatures of a neighbor moving carefully through the streets. He walked home slowly, tracing the same familiar streets. The subtle irregularities, the displaced mats, the minor scuffs, the impressions in the soil, felt like the quiet fingerprints of a person managing their small, controlled environment. The mystery, once tense and uncertain, settled into a calm understanding. It had not been a violent act or a dangerous intrusion, but the careful, unseen movements of someone creating order in their own deliberate way. The streets, the alleys, and the gardens returned to their ordinary rhythm, layered now with the quiet knowledge of what had been happening. The driver felt a sense of closure as he cataloged his notes for the last time. Each observation, each footprint, each scrap of paper had been part of a deliberate pattern, one that made sense once the pieces were joined, a quiet truth that unfolded steadily, without drama, in the soft, unhurried rhythm of everyday life. Case 2. The nurse on the night shift noticed a small update in one of the patient charts. It wasn't anything critical, just a slight change in dosage, but no one on her team had made it. When she checked the system logs, the update had been entered hours earlier, during a period when the station had been empty. The nurse sat back in her chair, the worn vinyl of the seat creaking under her weight. The terminal glowed faintly, casting pale rectangles of light across the empty station. Outside the window, the emergency entrance was quiet, the occasional wheeled gurney rattling past in the distance. She rubbed her temples, tasting the faint tang of antiseptic in the air, and tried to piece together how the chart could have been changed. She leaned closer to the screen. The timestamp didn't match any scheduled activity, and the username attached to the edit didn't correspond to anyone on the roster. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant to log out and risk losing her thread of thought. She noted the slight irregularity, a half-unit adjustment in a routine medication, insignificant on its own, yet impossible given the circumstances. A cart rolled quietly down the corridor, wheels whispering over the tile. She stood and glanced toward the hallway, the soft click of her shoes on linoleum blending with the distant murmur of the night cleaning crew. Nothing seemed out of place. No one was near the station when the update had occurred. She considered the security footage, but the cameras only covered public corridors, not the nurse's station itself. She opened the chart again, tracing the patient's medication history line by line. Everything else was as expected. Doses recorded on schedule, vitals stable, notes mundane. Only this single change stood out, almost like a fingerprint left behind. Her eyes caught a reflection in the monitor, a brief flicker of movement from the corner of the room, though when she turned, the space was empty. Later, she walked down the hallway toward the supply closet. The smell of cleaning solution mixed with the faint metallic scent of the night air creeping in from the back doors. She paused by a bulletin board, noting a stray paper clipped crookedly. Nothing unusual, except that it was dated the same day as the mysterious update. A scribbled note about inventory shortages seemed irrelevant, yet she photographed it with her phone, just in case. In the break room, the hum of the coffee machine filled the air. She poured herself a cup and stared out the narrow window at the parking lot. The lot was deserted, shadows stretching across the asphalt, the occasional flicker of headlights from a passing car across the street. She sipped slowly, noticing the subtle taste of burnt grounds, letting the warmth steady her thoughts. Back at the station, she scrolled through the system logs again. She noticed small anomalies, a brief pause in network activity, a delay in automatic backups, a series of failed login attempts that had gone unreported. Nothing overtly alarming, but together they created a pattern she couldn't ignore. A faint sound of movement made her look up. A janitor passed by, pushing a mop bucket, whistling softly. She waved, and he nodded. She returned to the terminal, watching her own reflection in the black screen as she pondered. Each detail seemed trivial on its own, yet accumulated into a subtle unease that she couldn't shake. Her phone buzzed with a notification, a reminder of her next rounds, but she delayed responding, drawn instead to the chart again. She tapped the patient's record, scrolling slowly, noting the rhythm of entries. She caught herself memorizing the normal cadence of updates, an almost hypnotic practice she'd never found necessary until tonight. Somewhere down the hall, a pager chirped, breaking the silence. She glanced toward the source, noting the blinking light on the wall. A momentary sense of intrusion passed through her, as though the building itself had quietly shifted around her awareness. Returning to the terminal, she realized she had been staring at the same line for minutes, and yet the question persisted, quietly gnawing. Who had been here, in this room, when no one was supposed to be? Outside, rain began to patter against the windows, soft at first, then heavier, tapping in uneven rhythms across the roof. She leaned back, listening, noticing the smell of wet asphalt mixing with antiseptic, the damp chill creeping through the vents. The night felt suspended, ordinary yet unsettled, and the chart sat open in front of her, silent and unyielding. Her thoughts wandered to the small, almost imperceptible details. A drawer slightly ajar, the faint scuff on the tile near the medication cabinet, the subtle warmth of the keyboard where hands might have lingered. Each fragment seemed to promise an answer, yet none revealed itself fully. Hours passed. She made her rounds mechanically, checking patients, refilling supplies, yet every glance at the monitor drew her back. The chart waited, unremarkable and yet entirely out of place. She noted the quiet hum of the refrigeration unit, the muffled footsteps of a security guard in the distance, and the occasional beep of a vital signs monitor, each sound grounding the night in familiarity, even as the mystery threaded through it. When she finally sat again, exhaustion pressed against her eyelids. She realized she had begun to record each observation in a notebook. Times, anomalies, brief impressions. The entries were careful, measured, almost ritualistic. Each line a small claim on understanding, each note a tether to the logic she could not yet reach. And outside, the rain continued, rhythmically insistent, while inside, the room remained empty except for the nurse, the screen, and a quiet sense that someone, or something, had moved through the station earlier, leaving nothing but a slight, inexplicable change behind. She left the station, notebook tucked under her arm, and walked toward the hospital's small chapel. The hall was narrow and empty, the walls lined with polished wood and pale posters for health seminars. The chapel smelled faintly of candle wax and old varnish, a quiet, almost sacred scent that felt out of place amid the antiseptic corridors. She paused at the door, listening to the subtle creak of the hinges, then stepped inside. The rows of chairs were orderly, polished to a soft sheen. Sunlight filtered through narrow stained glass windows, painting small, colored rectangles on the floor. She ran her fingers lightly along the edge of a pew, noting a faint scratch on the wood, too shallow to be noticed at a glance. She crouched to look closer, a tiny thread of blue fabric caught in the groove. It was subtle, insignificant by itself, but she photographed it anyway, marking the time in her notebook. Exiting the chapel, she wandered toward the hospital garden. The night air carried the damp scent of rain-soaked soil and freshly cut grass. Gravel crunched under her shoes as she passed a small fountain, its water rippling quietly under the weak light of a single lamp. She noticed a discarded surgical mask near the edge of the path, slightly damp, as though someone had dropped it earlier and not retrieved it. She picked it up, examined it, then set it aside, again recording details, small pieces of the environment that didn't quite fit. The hospital's utility corridors were next, narrow tunnels lined with pipes and electrical boxes. The air smelled faintly of ozone and rust. She ran her hand along the metal railing as she walked, noticing faint smudges where the surface was warmer. Perhaps a hand had lingered there recently. A series of faint scuff marks along the floor drew her attention, irregular, as though someone had moved quickly in patches, yet not enough to suggest a rush. She traced the marks, noting the pattern in her notebook, feeling the tension in the quiet corridor. She paused outside the hospital's small maintenance shed, its door slightly ajar. The smell of lubricating oil and dust drifted out. Inside, empty shelves and stacked boxes gave little clue, yet a small notebook lay on the floor near a workbench, open to a page filled with precise, neat handwriting. She flipped it over carefully. Most pages were routine, inventory lists, repair logs. But one entry caught her eye, a cryptic notation of times and initials that matched nothing she had seen in the hospital roster. She photographed the page and added it to her growing collection of oddities. Walking back toward the main building, she paused near the loading bay. The rain had turned the asphalt slick, reflecting the pale light of overhead lamps. She noticed a single footprint in the wet concrete, small, narrow, and incomplete, just the heel and ball of a shoe. It led toward the side door, then disappeared under a puddle. The subtle disturbance in the water made her lean closer, crouching, tracing the shallow ripples with her fingers. Later, she returned to the nurse's lounge, filling a thermos with lukewarm coffee. The kitchenette smelled faintly of bleach and old coffee grounds. She poured the drink, letting the warmth seep into her hands, then settled in a corner with her notebook open. She reviewed each entry, the thread, the mask, the smudges, the scuff marks, the mysterious notation. Each seemed trivial alone, yet together they suggested movement, presence, something unseen yet methodical. A soft knock at the door made her glance up. A colleague from the day shift peered in, carrying a clipboard. "Just finishing some charts," he said softly, noting the open notebook. She nodded without explaining, returning to her observations. He lingered briefly, remarking on the storm outside, the faint flicker of lights, then moved on, leaving her in quiet company with her thoughts. Her gaze fell on the terminal again, still logged into the patient's chart. The earlier timestamp that had started all of this remained unchanged, and yet a new anomaly appeared. A brief sequence of system alerts, barely perceptible, buried in logs she had initially overlooked. She scrolled slowly, pausing at each line, noting the timing, the repeated attempts to access specific modules. By the window, rain dripped steadily, the sound rhythmic and steady. She leaned back in her chair, listening carefully to the subtle shifts in the hospital around her. The soft wheeze of a ventilator in a distant room, the distant rolling of a laundry cart, the occasional hiss of an automatic door. Each ordinary sound seemed to frame the small, strange puzzle she was gathering. Each ordinary corridor and room layered with an almost imperceptible tension. She traced her steps in the notebook once more, connecting the overlooked details, the chapel thread, the garden mask, the utility corridor scuffs, the maintenance shed note, the footprint in the wet asphalt, and now the new system alerts. Each small observation added another thread to the growing tapestry, yet the central figure remained invisible, the motive unclear. Time passed in quiet reflection, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain and the occasional distant hum of machinery. The hospital held its usual rhythms, yet through the nurse's attentive eyes, the ordinary became quietly suspect, each small anomaly a reminder that someone had been there, moving carefully, deliberately, and leaving only the faintest trace behind. She left the lounge and made her way toward the hospital's old records room, a narrow annex tucked behind the administrative offices. The door was heavy, the metal handle cold under her fingers. Inside, rows of beige filing cabinets stretched toward the ceiling, each drawer labeled with faint, fading letters. The air smelled of dust and paper, dry and slightly musty, with a faint hint of ink. She ran her hand along a cabinet edge, dislodging a thin cloud of dust that drifted lazily in the dim light. One drawer, slightly misaligned, caught her attention. She tugged it open carefully. Inside, patient charts stacked neatly were interrupted by a single folder that seemed newer, its edges sharp and uncreased. She flipped it open and found routine notes, but one page contained a brief annotation in handwriting that was precise, almost mechanical, noting a time and a medication code that didn't match the standard protocol. She jotted it down in her notebook, the pen scratching softly against the paper. From the records room, she wandered down a service corridor she had passed only in daylight before. The walls were scuffed, the linoleum dull, but the faint smell of cleaning solution lingered in patches. She paused near a utility closet where the door rattled slightly as though disturbed by the HVAC system. Inside, she found a stack of envelopes, one of which had been torn open and left on the floor. It contained supply invoices, but one note tucked inside. A sticky note, curling at the edges, had the same initials she had seen in the maintenance shed notebook. She photographed it carefully. She stepped into the hospital cafeteria, empty except for a janitor loading a cart with trays. The fluorescent lights flickered softly above her, casting uneven shadows across the tables. She ran her fingers along a tabletop, noticing a faint streak of something dark, sticky, almost like dried syrup. It didn't match any recent spills she remembered seeing. She swabbed it with a tissue, setting it aside, cataloging it quietly. Later, she passed the hospital morgue doors, the cold metal frame radiating a faint chill into the hallway. She lingered just a moment, noticing a small scuff on the floor nearby, the kind of mark a cart wheel or heavy shoe might leave. Nothing seemed overtly significant, yet she recorded it, the instinct for pattern unrelenting. The morgue itself remained locked, silent, its small window dark and uninviting. A soft tap on the glass of the staff entrance made her look up. A delivery driver had set down a package, his figure outlined in the rain-slicked pavement. She watched him leave before approaching, noting that the package bore no return address and the handwriting was unfamiliar. Inside, she found ordinary supplies, gauze, bandages, but tucked at the bottom was a small, folded note with a brief code and a date that coincided with the time of the mysterious chart change. She photographed it, careful to keep her hand steady. Back in the corridor leading to the nurse's station, she paused near a fire extinguisher cabinet. The glass was smudged, faint fingerprints leading diagonally across the surface, not at eye level but lower, as though someone had crouched. She leaned closer, noting the texture of the smudge and how recently it might have been left. She pressed her gloved fingertip gently to it, almost instinctively, then withdrew it, the image recorded in her mind more than on paper. The elevator lobby nearby hummed faintly, the metal doors cooled beneath her fingers. She pressed the button, waiting as the car descended slowly from the upper floors. She noticed a small piece of tape along the edge of the panel, frayed slightly, perhaps marking a prior repair. The detail was subtle, mundane even, but she made a note, aware that these small irregularities often hinted at larger patterns. By the time she returned to the nurse's station, the storm outside had intensified. Rain streaked the windows, bouncing in uneven patterns on the asphalt below. The fluorescent lights flickered briefly, then steadied, illuminating the terminal still logged into the patient chart. She sat down and began to cross-reference the new anomalies. The older chart note, the maintenance initials, the sticky note from the service corridor, the package, the faint smudges. Each element felt like a whisper, an unseen presence threading through ordinary spaces, leaving behind the barest trace. Her eyes drifted to the quiet hospital beyond the windows, the loading dock slick with water, the garden path glistening, the distant hum of refrigeration units and emergency generators. She noted every sound, every shadow, every faint disturbance that might be connected. The rhythm of the building, familiar and mundane, now carried a subtle tension, as though each room held its own secrets, waiting to be uncovered slowly, one small clue at a time. She sipped her coffee, now cold, and turned back to the notebook. The collection of tiny observations was growing, each entry deliberate, measured, a slow accumulation of fragments. She traced the edges of her notes, touching the corners where the paper had slightly curled from dampness in the air, and thought about the night as a quiet investigator's landscape, one where the ordinary carried the weight of something carefully hidden, something just out of sight. She left the nurse's station again, notebook in hand, moving toward the hospital's rarely used imaging wing. The hallway was narrower here, walls painted a muted beige that absorbed most of the light, leaving shadows along the baseboards. A faint hum came from the MRI room, even though no scans were scheduled. She paused, tilting her head to catch the subtle vibration through the floor tiles, the soft mechanical rhythm oddly grounding in the quiet. The room's door was slightly ajar, a faint smell of antiseptic mixed with ozone drifting out. She stepped inside, careful not to disturb the faintly reflective floor. The machine sat idle, the board dark and empty, the control panel blinking a small, solitary green light. She ran a gloved hand over the edge of the console, noticing a faint streak of smudged fingerprints near the buttons, small and deliberate. She photographed it from multiple angles, noting the time and temperature in her notebook. Next, she moved toward the supply hallway adjoining the wing. It was lined with tall metal shelves, stacked with boxes of gloves, syringes, and tubing. One shelf in particular caught her attention, slightly askew, as though someone had hurriedly pushed the boxes aside. She pulled a box forward, and a folded piece of paper slipped from the gap between boxes. It contained a short list of initials and times, written in a precise, almost mechanical hand. Her pulse quickened slightly, not with alarm, but with the quiet thrill of discovery. She pressed the paper flat in her notebook, careful not to smudge it. From there, she walked toward the rooftop access door, a part of the hospital she rarely needed to enter. The door was cold, metal against her palm, and the stairwell smelled faintly of damp concrete and machine oil. She climbed slowly, each step echoing in the narrow shaft. When she emerged onto the roof, the city stretched around her, glistening in the persistent rain. Puddles reflected the dim glow of streetlights, and she noticed a small, rectangular object half submerged in water near the edge of the roof, perhaps debris blown from below. She bent and retrieved it, a fragment of a delivery label, damp but legible, with numbers that matched the mysterious package from earlier. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and distant exhaust fumes. She moved toward the mechanical units clustered along the roof edge. Pipes coiled around the units, valves coated in a fine layer of dust. She ran her fingers along a cold pipe and noticed a faint smudge where it looked like someone had leaned against it, the residue almost imperceptible against the metal. She paused, observing how even in a space this exposed, there were signs of careful movement. Descending the stairwell, she passed the hospital chapel again, noting the way rain streamed down one of the outer windows, pooling slightly on the sill. The chapel smelled faintly of wax and damp stone. She leaned briefly to examine the window frame. A tiny scratch along the edge, barely visible, almost the width of a fingernail. She photographed it quickly, recording the detail in her notebook alongside the others. In the staff lounge, she poured another cup of coffee. The smell was weak, stale, but comforting in its familiarity. She sipped, listening to the faint hum of the vending machine in the corner and the drip of a faucet somewhere nearby. She spread out her growing collection of notes and photos. The fingerprints in the imaging room, the list from the supply hallway, the fragment from the rooftop, the scratch on the chapel window, the smudge on the rooftop pipe. Her phone vibrated with a text from a colleague, asking if she was still working late. She replied simply, "Something odd," and set the device aside. She leaned back, letting her eyes drift over the rows of chairs, the counters, the quiet glow of the machines in the distance. Each small anomaly she had found now felt like a whisper threading through the hospital's ordinary rhythm, subtle movements in ordinary spaces that suggested someone had been methodical, careful, and unseen. She stood again, walking toward the hospital's loading dock, drawn by the need to follow the path of deliveries and supplies. The dock was slick with rain, littered with scattered cardboard and plastic straps. She noticed faint tire marks leading from a side entrance to the main bay, irregular, as though a small cart had been guided quickly but cautiously. A faint smear on the concrete, darker than the surrounding wetness, caught her eye. She knelt to examine it, brushing her fingers lightly along the surface. It had the sticky, faintly oily texture of packaging adhesive. Rain drummed steadily overhead, and the distant street lights shimmered across the wet pavement. She straightened slowly, glancing up and down the dock, noticing the subtle quiet of the night, the hum of refrigeration units, the occasional drip from an overhanging gutter, the distant rolling of a cart in the main corridor. Each sound, each movement of air and water, seemed to underscore the strange, meticulous presence threading through the building. Back in the main corridors, she retraced her steps slowly, connecting the newest details to her earlier observations. The precise chart changes, the odd initials, the subtle smudges, the rooftop fragment, the scratch in the chapel. She paused in a quiet hallway, leaning against the wall, feeling the coolness of the paint through her sleeve. She could almost imagine the movements of whoever had left these traces, careful and deliberate, threading through the hospital in ways that avoided detection, leaving behind only the faintest hints of their presence. She returned finally to the nurse's station, the storm outside easing to a steady drizzle. The fluorescent lights hummed evenly, the monitors blinked quietly, and the terminal glowed with the patient chart open. She opened her notebook, tracing her fingers over the growing map of small discoveries. Each one was quiet, subtle, and fragmentary, but together they hinted at a pattern she could not yet fully see. And in the calm, methodical rhythm of the night, she understood that someone had moved through the hospital with intent, leaving behind only the softest evidence of their passage. She pushed open the side door leading to the hospital's basement, a section she rarely needed to enter. The air was cooler here, damp and faintly metallic, carrying the smell of old pipes and concrete. Fluorescent lights lined the ceiling, casting uneven rectangles of illumination across the floor. She stepped carefully, her shoes echoing softly against the tile, and paused to notice a small, dark smudge along the edge of the wall, a subtle streak, as if someone had brushed past in a hurry. The basement corridors twisted into storage areas, utility rooms, and maintenance closets. She passed a room marked sterile supplies and paused at the faint hiss of the ventilation system. A small stack of unopened boxes had shifted slightly, one leaning outward. She adjusted it and saw a folded slip of paper tucked between the gaps, edges curling. On it were times and initials she didn't recognize, accompanied by a sequence of numbers that reminded her of the chart anomalies. She photographed it carefully and returned it to its spot, mindful not to disturb the subtle arrangement. She walked toward the hospital's boiler room, a space she had visited only once during training. The floor was damp, the metal walls cold, carrying the faint vibration of humming machinery. Pipes crisscrossed overhead, dripping occasionally, and the sound of water echoed faintly through the space. She noticed a thin streak along a valve handle, smudged as though someone had adjusted it recently. The residue was almost imperceptible, but it stood out in the otherwise polished surface. She ran her gloved finger along it lightly and made a note in her notebook. A few steps away, she found an emergency exit that led to the back alley. Rain had formed shallow puddles across the cracked asphalt, reflecting the dim glow of a single street lamp. She crouched to examine a corner where water had pooled, noticing a faint indentation in the wet surface. A partial footprint, narrow and elongated, leading toward a side door she knew was usually locked. The impression had softened under the rain, but she traced its outline with her fingertip, recording its orientation and depth. She returned inside, moving through the basement toward a small staff kitchenette tucked between corridors. The fluorescent light buzzed faintly above, illuminating the chipped countertop and the faint sticky residue near the sink. A half-empty bottle of sanitizer sat on the edge, slightly tipped, as though nudged recently. She picked it up, examining the label, and noticed a tiny scratch on the cap that wasn't consistent with normal use. She photographed it and added it to her notebook alongside the other anomalies. Ascending the stairs to the second floor, she paused outside the hospital library, a room she seldom entered. The heavy glass doors were locked, but through the window, she could see rows of books and journals, neatly aligned. One shelf near the back appeared slightly shifted, the top row leaning forward. She could not tell if it had been recent or long-standing, but she made a mental note to return during daytime hours. In the quiet corridor outside, she overheard a faint conversation, two security guards speaking softly as they passed a checkpoint. She slowed, pretending to check her watch, listening to their words about routine patrols and minor maintenance issues. There was nothing overtly suspicious, yet one mention of a recently reported access card anomaly caught her attention. She jotted it down, the name of the staff member and time noted carefully, adding it to the growing tapestry of small, quiet irregularities. Later, she walked past the hospital's small rooftop garden, its planters slick with rain and leaves. The stone benches were wet, and the soil of the flower beds had been recently disturbed, faint imprints visible along the edges. She crouched, brushing away a few fallen leaves, and noticed a tiny fragment of paper, partially torn, caught in the dirt. On it were printed numbers matching the earlier chart codes, though arranged differently. She photographed it, careful to preserve its orientation and position. Back inside, she returned to the nurse's station. The monitors blinked in quiet rhythm, the storm outside easing to a light drizzle. She spread her notes across the counter. Fingerprints and smudges in the imaging wing, small fragments and initials from supply rooms, rooftop traces, subtle scratches on chapel windows, partial footprints in wet asphalt and basement corners, and the newly discovered paper fragment from the rooftop garden. She sat in the chair, hands tracing the edges of the notebook, trying to find patterns in the quiet accumulation of details. Each small observation seemed insignificant alone, yet together they suggested careful, deliberate movement, threading through the hospital in spaces she would never expect. The ordinary corridors, stairwells, and rooms had become a map of subtle disturbances, each whispering a presence that remained unseen, leaving only faint traces of intention behind. Her eyes drifted toward the windows overlooking the back alley, watching the rain ripple in the puddles, the distant glow of streetlights reflected across the wet asphalt. The night stretched on in gentle rhythm, each sound and shadow a quiet accompaniment to the growing sense that the hospital held its secrets close, and that someone had moved through it with care, leaving behind only the softest, most deliberate evidence of their passage. She left the nurse's station again, moving toward the seldom-used administration wing. The carpet was threadbare here, muted gray with patches of darker wear, soft underfoot, yet damp with a faint mustiness that clung to her shoes. Fluorescent panels overhead flickered intermittently, leaving the hallway intermittently shadowed. She ran a hand along the wall rail, noting a faint residue where fingers had left behind streaks of dirt or oil. It was subtle, barely noticeable, yet in the quiet it felt deliberate. A small office door, cracked slightly, drew her attention. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and printer toner, the desk cluttered with folders stacked unevenly. One folder, pushed slightly askew, contained a set of staff schedules. She flipped through, pausing at a page that listed a maintenance worker's shifts alongside a series of times that corresponded with the mysterious chart change. She noted it, careful to mark the page in her notebook. Continuing down the hall, she passed the hospital's conference room. The blinds were drawn, but through a small gap she saw rows of chairs, neatly aligned, and a table that bore faint circular rings where mugs had once sat. She noticed one cup ring that seemed newer than the others, edges sharp against the polished wood. Leaning closer, she found a small smudge on the tabletop, barely discernible but dark against the grain. She photographed it and returned to the corridor, cataloging it alongside her other subtle findings. She descended another stairwell toward the hospital's basement loading area. The smell of damp concrete and oil was stronger here, mixed with the faint tang of rust from the pipes. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting moving shadows. A small pallet had been shifted slightly, leaving faint marks in the dust on the floor. She knelt and traced the pattern with her gloved finger, a zigzag, uneven, almost hesitant, as if someone had stopped and reconsidered their steps. She made a careful sketch in her notebook. At the far end of the basement, she found a small room labeled Archives, filled with boxes of old patient records. One box had fallen over, papers spilling onto the floor. Among them was a single envelope, sealed, but with a faint crease as though it had been handled several times. On the envelope were initials she recognized from the maintenance log and the supply slips. She photographed it before replacing it, careful not to disturb the other papers. She paused in the corridor outside, listening. The hum of the ventilation system was punctuated by distant beeps from machinery, the soft echo of water dripping from a pipe joint, and the occasional muted thud from the upper floors. She realized she was piecing together movement patterns without seeing anyone, following the faint traces left behind. Later, she wandered into the hospital's small indoor courtyard, a space she had rarely explored. Potted plants lined the perimeter, some leaves bent under the persistent drizzle that had leaked through a partially open skylight. She noticed a single set of footprints pressed into the damp soil along the edge of a path, narrow and precise, leading toward a side exit she rarely saw used. She traced them with her eyes, careful not to step in the same tracks, and noted the pattern in her notebook. She moved toward the staff locker area, where the smell of damp clothing and faint perfume lingered. One locker door was slightly ajar, revealing a jacket pushed back unevenly. A small stain on the sleeve, dark and sticky, caught her attention. She ran her gloved fingertip lightly across it, noting its texture and position, then recorded it. The details seemed trivial, yet in the context of the other traces, it felt purposeful. Back in the quiet hallway leading to the nurse's station, she passed a fire hose cabinet with glass slightly fogged from condensation. Faint streaks marked the glass, vertical and parallel, as if someone had pressed against it in a rush or leaned for balance. She photographed it, marking it as part of the growing trail. When she finally returned to her chair at the station, she spread out her notes and photographs across the counter. Each small anomaly, smudges, prints, scraps of paper, scratches, droplets, stains, impressions, formed a map of subtle, deliberate activity threading through the hospital. She sipped the lukewarm coffee in her thermos, listening to the distant hum of machinery and the occasional drip of rainwater along the roof drains. Her gaze drifted to the terminal. The patient chart remained open, the timestamp of the unexplained update unchanged. Each new discovery she had made tonight connected to it in small, almost imperceptible ways, but the picture remained incomplete. Someone had moved carefully through the hospital, leaving behind traces that were easy to overlook, yet impossible to ignore when observed together. The presence was patient, deliberate, and unseen, threading its way through ordinary spaces, and she felt a quiet tension as she realized the investigation had only just begun. She left the nurse's station again, drawn toward the seldom-used outpatient wing. The corridor was quieter than the rest of the hospital, the usual buzz of monitors and machinery replaced by faint echoes of her footsteps. The walls were painted a muted sage green, chipped in places, and the linoleum had a faint sheen from recent cleaning. She ran her hand along the rail, feeling a subtle stickiness near the base, a small smudge, irregular, like something had dripped or been wiped carelessly. A small consultation room door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and hand lotion. The table was empty except for a single patient folder left at the edge, angled as if pushed aside quickly. She opened it carefully, noting a brief note in neat handwriting, a time, an initial, and a single line about a routine procedure. The handwriting matched no one she knew, yet the time corresponded to the earlier chart update. She photographed it and returned the folder to its exact position. In the corner of the room, a chair had been pushed back slightly, leaving faint scuff marks on the floor. She knelt to trace the pattern, noticing tiny specks of dirt caught in the floor seams. She photographed these as well, feeling a growing sense of someone having moved deliberately but carefully through spaces that were ordinarily static. From there, she wandered into a small storage alcove adjacent to the wing. The shelves were stacked with paper forms, boxes of gloves, and small equipment. One shelf leaned ever so slightly, revealing a folded piece of paper tucked behind the boxes. On it were cryptic numbers and letters, some of which echoed sequences she had seen in other locations. The rooftop garden fragment, the maintenance notebook, and the supply slips. She flattened the paper on her notebook page and photographed it. A faint noise drew her attention to a janitor quietly wheeling a mop bucket past a service doorway. She paused, pretending to check a clipboard, and noticed the janitor's shoes left small wet marks on the otherwise clean floor, leading toward a door she had not explored before. She followed the trail, careful to observe rather than interfere. The door led to a narrow service stairwell, the walls lined with peeling paint and old piping. The faint smell of damp concrete and rust hung in the air. Halfway down the stairs, she noticed a thin, vertical scratch along the railing, almost at shoulder height. She touched it lightly with a gloved fingertip, noting the direction and depth. It seemed recent, deliberate yet unobtrusive. Further along, a small piece of paper had been wedged between the metal steps. A folded note with an initial and a time, again echoing the pattern she had been tracking. At the basement landing, she found a door leading to the hospital's old records archive, a room she had never entered. The air smelled of dust and ink, faintly moldy, and the light was dim, filtered through a single small window. Cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled in fading letters. One drawer was slightly open, revealing a file whose edge had been bent, a subtle imperfection in an otherwise orderly space. Inside was a chart note with a precise time and the same unfamiliar initials she had been tracking. She photographed it, then closed the drawer gently. She retraced her steps toward the corridor, pausing at a utility closet door that rattled faintly with the ventilation system. Inside, a stack of envelopes had shifted, one partially open. She pulled it out carefully, noting that the envelope contained routine supply invoices. But one piece of paper tucked inside had a handwritten sequence of letters and numbers that matched the chart code from earlier. She photographed it and replaced it exactly. Later, she paused outside the hospital chapel again. The rain had softened into a drizzle, and the faint smell of damp stone mixed with candle wax. She noticed a single window latch slightly loosened, a faint fingerprint along the metal edge. She traced it carefully with her gloved hand and added a note in her growing record of observations. Back in the hallway, she overheard a soft conversation between two night shift technicians discussing a minor maintenance glitch with one of the elevators. She slowed, noting the time and the elevator's identification number. The timing matched another anomaly she had recorded in the patient chart system, and she jotted it down quietly. Finally, she returned to the nurse's station. The monitors glowed quietly, the patient chart open on the screen. Her notebook was now filled with photographs, sketches, times, initials, smudges, scratches, and small paper fragments from locations throughout the hospital. The rooftop garden, the imaging wing, supply rooms, stairwells, the chapel, the basement archives, and the outpatient wing. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, listening to the faint drip of water from the ventilation system, the soft hum of refrigeration units, and the distant rolling of carts along tiled corridors. Each ordinary sound seemed to underscore the subtle, methodical presence threading through the hospital. The traces she had gathered suggested movement, deliberation, and care. Someone had been here, moving unseen, leaving only the quietest, most precise evidence behind. And in the calm rhythm of the night, she felt that the puzzle was still far from complete. She pushed open the side door to the hospital's small loading courtyard. The drizzle had turned to a fine mist, coating the asphalt with a thin sheen that reflected the dim light of a single lamp above the service entrance. She stepped carefully, listening to the muted squish of her shoes. Crumpled cardboard lay near the edge of the dock, damp and curling, and she noticed a faint streak across the surface. Dark, sticky, almost imperceptible unless one crouched close. She photographed it, noting the direction it led toward a seldom-used storage shed. The shed door was ajar, hinges groaning softly as she eased it open. Inside, stacks of linen and boxes of disposable gowns filled the room, a faint smell of fabric softener lingering in the air. One of the boxes had been shifted slightly. The topmost gown bore a faint streak of dirt, smeared across the fabric in a pattern that suggested someone had leaned against it or brushed past quickly. She touched it lightly with a gloved finger, noting the texture, then set it aside. At the back of the shed, a small window overlooked the hospital's side alley. She crouched to peer through it. Puddles reflected the faint glow of a street lamp, and she noticed a single, small footprint leading toward a side door she had never entered. She traced the pattern carefully with her eyes, noting its size and shape, then stepped back to examine the sill, a tiny scuff mark where someone had pushed the window up slightly to peer out. Returning to the main corridor, She passed the hospital's radiology waiting room. The chairs were arranged neatly. Though one seat had a faint indentation, the upholstery compressed as though recently vacated. On the low table in front of it, a discarded brochure had slipped under the edge of the furniture, the corner bent. She picked it up, noting the corner crease, and photographed it, recording its location. From there, she wandered down a quiet hallway toward the staff mailroom. The room smelled faintly of paper and toner. Shelves were lined with envelopes and small parcels. One parcel sat slightly apart from the others, the label damp from the mist outside. She bent to inspect it, noting a tiny scratch across the corner of the box, almost like a fingernail had caught it. She photographed it, recording the tracking number and approximate delivery time. She moved toward the hospital's small mechanical room next, a space she rarely visited. The pipes overhead were coated in a fine layer of dust, dripping occasionally where condensation had formed. A valve near the back bore a faint smear of grease, not in a circular motion as from regular maintenance, but linear, as though someone had rested a hand while passing. She traced it with her gloved finger, noting the unusual angle and length. Later, she paused in the hospital's old elevator lobby. The door to the freight elevator was slightly misaligned, and she noticed a faint smudge along the edge of the metal panel where someone might have pushed to close it. A small piece of paper had fallen to the floor near the threshold, damp from the mist tracked in from the courtyard. It contained a brief set of initials and numbers that matched sequences she had seen elsewhere. She photographed it, tucking it carefully into her notebook. Finally, she wandered toward the hospital's quiet staff lounge on the upper floor. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. A chair had been pushed back slightly, leaving a subtle mark on the carpet. She noticed a faint line of dust disturbed along the baseboard where someone had passed, brushing lightly against the wall. She traced it with her fingertip, recording the direction and intensity of the disturbance. Back at the nurse's station, she spread out the day's collection of subtle anomalies. Smudges on railings, scuff marks on floors, damp fingerprints, displaced boxes, small scraps of paper, footprints, and the faint impressions of chairs and upholstery. Each detail alone seemed insignificant, yet together they formed a network of careful, deliberate movement, threading through corridors, stairwells, storage rooms, and quiet courtyards. She poured herself a cup of lukewarm coffee, listening to the rhythmic patter of mist against the windows, the occasional hum of a ventilation fan, and the distant, soft rolling of a cart along tiled corridors. Each ordinary sound, each shadowed corner, carried the quiet trace of someone who had moved unseen, leaving behind only faint, almost imperceptible evidence of their passage. And as she traced her fingers over the notebook pages, she understood that the investigation was only deepening. Each discovery added a layer, yet the central figure remained invisible, their intent still concealed within the hospital's calm, ordinary spaces. She decided to check the seldom-used imaging prep rooms on the far side of the hospital. The corridor leading there was narrower, the walls a dull beige, corners scuffed and marked with fingerprints that had long since faded. The hum of the ventilation system carried faintly through the air, mixing with the muted echo of her own steps. She ran a gloved hand along the edge of a counter outside one room and felt a sticky residue, barely perceptible. She paused, noting the unusual texture and taking a photo with her phone. The prep room door was slightly ajar, its latch squeaking softly as she pushed it open. Inside, the cold, polished tiles reflected the pale glow of the overhead lights. She noticed the faint outline of a chair against the wall, its rubber feet leaving small, irregular impressions on the floor. On the counter beside it was a tray of equipment, one item slightly out of place. A small vial tilted just enough to catch the light differently than the others. She examined it carefully, noting a faint smudge along the glass, as if someone had adjusted it without much care. She stepped into the adjacent darkroom used for developing scans, a space she rarely entered. The air smelled faintly of chemical solvents, sharp but not overpowering. A small puddle of water had collected near the sink, and a faint smear along the edge suggested a damp hand had pressed against it. She photographed the mark and made a sketch in her notebook, comparing the time she estimated it might have been left to the earlier updates in the patient chart system. From there, she moved toward the hospital's rarely used staff stairwell, one that led to the roof garden. The walls were chipped, and the linoleum carried a thin layer of dust in areas where foot traffic was infrequent. She paused to notice a small indentation in the wall near the light switch, barely noticeable, like something heavy had brushed against it. She traced it with her gloved finger, noting its shape and direction. Emerging onto the roof garden, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the soil in the flower beds dark and slightly compacted. She walked carefully along the gravel paths, noticing faint footprints leading toward the north corner where a small maintenance shed stood. The door was closed, but the lock looked as if it had been recently handled. Faint scratches marked the metal surface. She bent down to examine the wet ground at the threshold and noticed a small, torn piece of paper embedded in the soil, damp but still legible. It bore a short sequence of numbers matching those she had seen in the supply invoices and the chart notation. She returned to the main corridor, passing the hospital's small seminar room. The chairs were stacked neatly against the wall, but one chair's rubber foot had left a faint scuff mark on the carpet, angled differently from the others. She knelt to study it, noting the direction and depth. On the low table beside the stack, a single sticky note had been overlooked. It contained initials she recognized from earlier, along with a time that aligned with one of the unscheduled chart changes. Moving on, she visited the hospital's small kitchenette on the administrative floor. The smell of faintly burnt coffee lingered. A cup had been pushed to the edge of the counter, leaving a ring on the laminate surface. Nearby, the handle of the refrigerator had a subtle smear of grease, almost invisible in the dim light, suggesting someone had rested a hand there briefly. She photographed both, adding them to the slowly growing map of anomalies. She paused outside the hospital chapel again, noting the rain dripping steadily from the roof onto the stone walkway. The window latch still bore the faint fingerprint she had seen earlier, now appearing more distinct in the slightly brighter light. She traced the pattern with her fingertip, recording it carefully. A single leaf had been blown against the wall, partially wet, forming a small shadow that moved with the wind. She noted its position and the subtle shift of its placement as if disturbed by movement through the space. Back at the nurse's station, she spread out the new observations alongside the old ones. Faint smudges, scuff marks, prints in wet soil, scraps of paper, tilted vials, sticky residues, and fingerprints on windows and handles. Each fragment on its own seemed trivial, yet together they formed a network of deliberate, careful activity threading through offices, stairwells, storage rooms, prep areas, and quiet courtyards. She sipped lukewarm coffee, listening to the soft hum of machines and the distant drip of water from the roof drains, the hospital's ordinary rhythm now infused with a subtle tension. Her eyes drifted to the monitors, the patient chart still open, the timestamp unchanged. Each discovery suggested movement, presence, and intent, yet the person behind it remained invisible. The quiet accumulation of evidence made the hospital itself feel alive with traces of someone careful, meticulous, and unseen. She understood that each night's slow observations added depth to the investigation, but the central figure was still out of reach, threading their way through ordinary spaces and leaving behind only the faintest, most deliberate signs of passage. She left the nurse's station, deciding to revisit the hospital's rarely used cardiology wing. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the metallic tang of old equipment. The linoleum floor had a faint pattern of water streaks, as if someone had wiped it in a hurry. She paused by a wall-mounted hand sanitizer dispenser and noticed a small fingerprint on the nozzle, distinct and smudged, dark against the pale plastic. She photographed it carefully, noting the exact time and location. The cardiology prep room door was slightly cracked. She pushed it open, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm plastic. A tray of monitoring equipment sat on a counter, one cable looped differently than the others, the rubber sleeve showing a subtle crease, as though handled roughly but deliberately. She knelt to examine the marks on the counter. A faint dusting of residue caught along the edge, suggesting someone had leaned or brushed past while arranging the tray. She moved to the adjacent corridor that led to the diagnostic imaging archives. The walls were lined with cabinets, each labeled neatly, yet one drawer protruded slightly. She reached down, running her gloved fingers along the edge. A small smudge of dust and ink revealed that it had been opened recently, though no one had reported accessing the files. Inside the drawer, she found a single, folded piece of paper with a series of numbers and letters, some of which matched sequences she had seen on earlier slips from the rooftop and the supply room. She flattened it in her notebook, photographing the content and positioning. Next, she descended the service elevator to the hospital's sub-basement, a section few staff ever visited. The air was cooler, damp, and smelled faintly of mold and machine oil. Pipes ran overhead, and occasional drips echoed faintly. She noticed a faint trail of scuffed dust along the floor, leading toward a small utility closet. Inside, coils of tubing had been shifted, one slightly kinked, suggesting someone had moved them in haste or without care. She examined the kink, noting the direction and depth, and photographed it for reference. In a small adjacent break room, the fluorescent light flickered intermittently. A chair had been pushed back at an odd angle, leaving a subtle impression on the carpet. She ran her fingers over the mark, feeling its shape and depth, then lifted a nearby coffee mug to reveal a faint smear of dried liquid along the table edge. She recorded both details, noting their alignment with the nearby fingerprint on the sanitizer dispenser. She paused near the stairwell leading to the hospital's rooftop air conditioning units. The concrete steps were damp from condensation, and a faint scuff mark near the railing suggested careful passage. On the landing, she noticed a small fragment of torn paper caught under the edge of a drain pipe, wet but still legible. Numbers and initials on the fragment corresponded to the codes she had been tracking from supply rooms, prep areas, and the rooftop garden. She photographed it and tucked it carefully into her notebook. The hospital's chapel was quiet, the candles extinguished, faint wax scent lingering. She noticed the window latch she had examined before, still bearing a subtle fingerprint. On the stone sill, a small droplet of water had pooled, slightly streaked as if brushed by a sleeve or hand. She ran her gloved fingertip lightly over it, noting the pattern, and recorded the detail. Later, She wandered to the seldom-used conference room near the administrative offices. The chairs were stacked neatly, but one chair had a slight tilt, leaving a shallow impression in the carpet. On the table, a single sticky note rested beneath a corner of a folder containing initials and times matching other anomalies. She photographed it and recorded the connection to her previous findings. Back at the nurse's station, she laid out her notebook and photographs. Fingerprints, smudges, scuff marks, tilted vials, damp paper fragments, impressions of chairs, and disturbed surfaces. Each fragment alone seemed inconsequential, yet together they formed a subtle web of deliberate activity threading through the hospital's quiet spaces. Prep rooms, storage closets, stairwells, rooftop paths, basements, chapel, and corridors. She sipped her coffee, now lukewarm, listening to the distant hum of the ventilation system, the occasional drip of water from a pipe, and the faint rolling of carts along tiled corridors. Each ordinary sound now carried a sense of deliberate movement, a trace of someone methodical and unseen. The accumulation of subtle evidence suggested presence, intent, and careful planning. And yet, despite the growing map of anomalies, the person responsible remained elusive, threading through the hospital with precision and leaving only the softest, most deliberate traces behind. She decided to explore the hospital's rarely visited pathology corridor. The hall was narrow and smelled faintly of formalin, a chemical tang that clung to the back of her throat. The linoleum was scuffed and uneven, the edges where it met the walls darkened with accumulated dust. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved past glass-fronted cabinets, each containing neatly labeled specimen jars, their contents floating silently in pale liquid. A small supply closet caught her eye. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open carefully. Inside, the floor smelled faintly of cardboard and damp paper. A stack of specimen trays had shifted, one lying slightly askew. On it lay a tiny, crumpled piece of paper with neat, careful handwriting, an initial and a time that corresponded exactly with one of the chart updates. She photographed it without touching the fragile sheet. Further down the corridor, she passed a small utility alcove where janitorial equipment was stored. A mop bucket had been moved from its usual corner, leaving faint streaks on the floor. She crouched to trace them, noticing that the marks veered slightly toward a fire exit she rarely saw opened. Near the threshold, a thin smear of dirt on the door handle caught her attention. She touched it lightly with her glove, recording the pattern. She continued into the pathology break room, a cramped space with a faint lingering aroma of coffee and disinfectant. The refrigerator door had a subtle streak across the handle, faint but distinct. On the counter, a single cup had been pushed to the edge, leaving a ring of dried liquid that suggested recent movement. She photographed the mark, making careful notes in her notebook. A stairwell at the end of the corridor led to a maintenance platform overlooking the hospital's generator room. The metal stairs were slick with condensation, and the faint vibration of machinery hummed through the floor. She noticed scuff marks along the stair edges, small scratches on the handrail, and a faint smear of oil near the top step. It was subtle, easy to miss, yet suggested someone had lingered there, briefly, but deliberately. The generator room itself was dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of oil and heated metal. She stepped carefully along the narrow walkway. A small control panel had fingerprints smeared across the switches, not enough to appear obvious, but detectable in the low light. One switch had been nudged slightly, leaving it misaligned with the others. She photographed it, noting the exact position and time she had entered the room. Later, She wandered to the hospital's unused lecture hall on the top floor. The chairs were folded and stacked neatly, but one row had a faint indentation in the carpeting, a subtle mark as if someone had leaned there or knelt briefly. A lectern near the front bore a tiny scratch along its edge, irregular and linear, unlike the natural wear. She traced it with her gloved finger, recording its length and direction. She paused near a small supply cabinet in the hall outside the lecture room. A single box of gloves had been nudged, one slightly pulled forward. Tucked beneath it was a scrap of paper with a brief code she had seen before, faint but legible. She photographed it, careful not to move anything else in the cabinet. Back at the nurse's station, she spread the new observations alongside the old. Fingerprints, smudges, scuffs, impressions, streaks, and torn scraps of paper. Each fragment was small and seemingly insignificant on its own, but together they suggested deliberate movement across multiple floors, stairwells, break rooms, and maintenance areas. The traces were precise yet understated, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. She sipped her now lukewarm coffee, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system, the occasional drip of condensation, and the muted echo of distant footsteps. The hospital felt alive with presence, invisible yet tangible, threading carefully through ordinary spaces. Each quiet observation added depth to the map of movement she had begun to sketch. The figure responsible remained unseen, leaving behind only the faintest, most deliberate hints of their passage, and the night stretched on with the same steady, unhurried rhythm, punctuated by subtle anomalies waiting to be traced. She moved toward the hospital's seldom-used pathology storage wing, a series of rooms behind a set of double doors that remained locked most of the day. Tonight, one door was slightly ajar, just enough to let the faint hum of refrigeration escape into the corridor. She pushed it open, the hinges whispering under her touch. Inside, the air was cold and heavy with the faint metallic scent of preserved specimens. The floor tiles were slick from condensation, and a narrow strip along the wall where cleaning had mist-collected dust subtly disturbed in a zigzag pattern. She crouched to trace it with a gloved fingertip, noting its irregularity and direction. A small metal shelf against the far wall bore rows of jars, neatly labeled, yet one jar had been nudged slightly out of line. The lid bore a subtle smear, darkened against the frosted glass. She photographed it, careful to keep her shadow from falling across the surface. Nearby, a clipboard hung on a hook, the edge of the paper bent in a corner, a faint fingerprint pressed into the paper's surface. She lifted it slightly to photograph it before returning it precisely to its original place. From the storage wing, she moved down a narrow service corridor toward a small utility room that housed the hospital's emergency backup generator. The air here smelled faintly of oil and heated metal. A faint vibration from the machinery thrummed underfoot. She noticed a subtle streak of grease along the door handle where it might have been touched without care. On the floor, a small fragment of cardboard had been pressed flat, damp along one edge, bearing a scrawled number she recognized from previous slips and patient chart notes. She paused in the stairwell leading to the hospital roof. The concrete steps were damp and faintly mottled with age. A thin layer of dust caught along the edges. A single set of footprints, small and narrow, led up toward a door she rarely saw used. At the top, the roof garden was dark, wet, and quiet. Leaves were scattered unevenly across the gravel path, disturbed in a way that suggested someone had brushed past them. A small puddle bore faint streaks of mud leading toward a locked shed, its latch showing subtle scratches. She photographed the scene, noting the way the footprints disappeared into shadow. On the way back inside, she passed the rarely visited physical therapy wing. The floor had a faint sticky residue near the exercise machines, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but visible under careful inspection. One of the therapy mats had been shifted slightly from its usual alignment, a corner pressed down at an angle that suggested someone had knelt or leaned there. She noted the direction and depth of the impression, adding it to her growing map of subtle disturbances. She wandered into a small break room on the administrative floor. The air smelled faintly of coffee and faintly of disinfectant. A chair had been pulled back from the table, leaving a shallow impression in the carpet. On the table, a single cup ring and a faint smear near the edge caught her attention. She photographed both carefully, noting the alignment with fingerprints she had observed earlier in the corridor. Later, she explored the seldom-used lecture hall near the top floor. The chairs were folded neatly against the walls, but one row had subtle indentations in the carpeting, suggesting someone had paused there briefly. The lectern bore a faint linear scratch along the edge. She touched it lightly, noting its direction and depth, and recorded it in her notebook. A small sticky note under a corner of a folder on a nearby table contained initials she had seen elsewhere, along with a timestamp that matched one of the unscheduled chart updates. Back at the nurse's station, she spread out her notes and photographs across the counter. Fingerprints, smudges, scuff marks, impressions in carpet, tilted equipment, scraps of paper, streaks, and subtle scratches. Each individual fragment seemed trivial, but together they formed a network of careful, deliberate activity threading through multiple floors, stairwells, break rooms, storage areas, rooftop paths, and corridors. She sipped her coffee, now lukewarm, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation system, the occasional drip of condensation from pipes, and the soft echo of distant footsteps. Each ordinary sound seemed to carry the presence of someone moving deliberately but unseen, leaving traces too small for anyone else to notice. The accumulation of these details suggested careful planning, methodical movement, and a patient hand at work. Yet the person responsible remained invisible, threading quietly through the hospital, leaving only faint, deliberate evidence behind, as though the entire building were a stage for their unseen, meticulous passage. She decided to check the hospital's seldom-used pathology prep hallway, a narrow stretch tucked behind the main diagnostic labs. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with a metallic tang, and the faint hum of refrigeration units resonated underfoot. She ran her gloved fingers along the wall rail, noticing a thin smear of dust interrupted by a subtle streak, as if something had brushed against it and slid downward. She photographed it, tilting the camera to capture the depth of the impression. A door to a small supply closet was slightly ajar. Inside, stacks of cardboard boxes and trays of slides were shifted unevenly. One box had a corner crushed and a faint fingerprint pressed into the cardboard. Beneath it lay a small scrap of paper with a series of numbers and letters she had seen in other locations. The rooftop, the break room, the storage alcove. She flattened it in her notebook, careful not to disturb the surrounding items. She moved down a dim corridor leading toward the hospital's rarely used MRI prep rooms. The tiles were damp, and a faint streak of residue caught in the grout suggested someone had brushed against the wall. She paused by a door marked MRI Prep B, noticing a tiny scuff mark on the frame near the handle, almost invisible unless crouched low. Inside, the room smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm electronics. A coil pad had been shifted slightly, its edge creased, and a small vial of contrast fluid had been nudged out of alignment on the counter. She photographed both. From there, she wandered into the administrative supply closet across the hall. The shelves were orderly, yet one stack of forms had been nudged forward, exposing a folded paper tucked behind it. The paper contained initials and a timestamp, faint but legible, corresponding to one of the unscheduled chart changes. She photographed it and noted its location. A stairwell at the end of the hall led to the hospital's rarely visited roof access. The concrete steps were damp and pocked with small chips. She noticed tiny footprints in the dust along the edge of the landing, leading toward a door to a maintenance shed. Outside, the rooftop garden was slick with rain, leaves scattered along the gravel path. Faint soil marks suggested someone had knelt or leaned against one of the raised planters. A small scrap of paper had lodged itself against the base of a drain pipe, bearing numbers and letters she recognized from the other slips. She photographed it. She continued toward the hospital's seldom-used lecture hall. The air smelled faintly of dust and old upholstery. One row of chairs bore subtle indentations in the carpet, as though someone had paused there briefly. The lectern had a thin, linear scratch along its edge. She ran a gloved finger along it and recorded its depth and direction. Beneath a folder on the table lay a small sticky note with initials she had seen elsewhere and a time matching one of the earlier chart updates. Later, she explored a small maintenance room near the generator corridor. The air was heavy with oil and warm metal. She noticed a faint smear of grease along a valve handle, linear and deliberate, not like ordinary maintenance wear. On the floor, a corner of cardboard bore faint dirt marks and a partial sequence of numbers that aligned with other clues she had collected. Back at the nurse's station, she laid out her findings: fingerprints, scuffs, smudges, slight impressions, tilted equipment, scraps of paper, streaks, and scratches. Each seemed trivial alone, yet together they traced careful, deliberate movement across multiple floors, corridors, stairwells, prep rooms, rooftop paths, and storage areas. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, listening to the distant hum of ventilation, the occasional drip of condensation, and the soft echo of wheels from carts rolling along distant hallways. The ordinary sounds now carried the faint presence of someone moving carefully, deliberately, unseen. Each small observation deepened the map of traces left behind. The figure responsible remained invisible, threading quietly through the hospital, leaving only the faintest, most deliberate hints of their passage, and the night stretched on with the steady, patient rhythm of accumulated anomalies. She returned to the small supply closet where the first scrap of paper had been found. Sitting on the floor, she spread out all the fragments, the photographs, and her notes. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, not in any dramatic way, but quietly, almost imperceptibly. The numbers and initials she had traced through the hospital corridors, the rooftop garden, the lecture hall, and the maintenance rooms were all connected to a single staff member, a technician who had been responsible for updating inventory, moving equipment, and maintaining the seldom-used prep areas. She thought back to the faint grease smears, the displaced boxes, the subtle impressions in carpet, and the tiny scratches on counters. None of them were acts of malice. They were traces of someone moving methodically, correcting errors, and reconciling supplies and patient charts that had quietly drifted out of order over the previous weeks. The fingerprints and small disturbances were signs of careful, conscientious work, not intrusion. Returning to the rooftop garden, she crouched by the drain pipe where the torn paper had been lodged. The numbers corresponded to a supply order that had been misfiled in the system. The technician had noticed discrepancies and, outside of regular hours, had moved through the hospital to reconcile the records, adjusting charts and notes where necessary. The small scrap of paper tucked under a cabinet, the slight tilt of chairs, the shifted vials, each was incidental, a byproduct of someone quietly doing their job, unseen by others, leaving traces without disrupting patients or staff. She retraced her steps through the corridors and stairwells, imagining the technician moving carefully but silently, pausing at the MRI prep room, checking equipment, then heading to the generator room to log maintenance. The subtle scuff marks, the fingerprint on the sanitizer dispenser, the damp corner of cardboard, they all aligned with the hours when the technician had worked alone, filling gaps in the system. Back at the nurse's station, she set down her notebook and photographs. The mystery that had seemed urgent and threatening now settled into quiet understanding. The charts had not been tampered with for harm. The anomalies were the slow, meticulous work of someone ensuring that everything was in order, navigating a complex hospital system without drawing attention. She leaned back in her chair and looked around the dimly lit station. The hum of ventilation, the occasional drip of condensation, the soft rolling of carts, all returned to their usual rhythm. The hospital felt ordinary again, yet she carried with her the map of quiet diligence that had threaded through every corridor, room, and stairwell. The truth was simple, subtle, and human. No one had intruded. No one had endangered the patients. The technician's careful corrections, once hidden, had created the faint trail of evidence she had followed. Each fingerprint, each scuff, each misplaced scrap of paper was a quiet signature of someone committed to order. She sipped the last of her lukewarm coffee, listening to the night settle around her. The hospital breathed steadily, the corridors empty, the rooms quiet. The case, once tangled in shadows and uncertainty, now rested in clarity. The traces remained, but the meaning was clear. Everything had been accounted for, reconciled, and understood. She stood, closing her notebook with a soft click. The quiet work of the night had revealed itself fully, gently, and without fanfare. The hospital, once threaded with mystery, returned to its ordinary, steady rhythm, and she walked out into the pale morning light, carrying the calm satisfaction of a puzzle quietly solved.